I'd agree with that. And the commonalities of the examples David mentions where it works well, two things happen. One is in all of those, and he's mentioned some that were back when the party roles were reversed, so I think it's a bipartisan statement. The opposition moves from simply waiting for government to have an idea and then saying, well, that's terrible, and hopefully enough people are mad at you that we can benefit, to proposing, like you did with Safe Haven, which, like, a couple of those you mentioned came out of private members' bills. Sure. And I think that's, when it happens, that's when some of the best work happens. The other thing is government has to reciprocate. Too often consultation is something that happens after your first idea blows up. And I think one way to get past that is government sometimes has to share power. I know when I was in opposition, I often wonder if you feel the same way some days, David, is you walk out a question period, you've gotten under government's skin, and you almost feel like finding a way to cut through and to say to them, the reason why I'm doing this is because you guys only listen to me when I create enough of a headache that you engage me. If government was more willing sometimes to say, here's a social problem, and I think the anti-poverty initiative is one where that has happened. Here's a problem. Before we get hard and fast positions, why don't we assume we're both folks of good faith who are here for the right reasons, see if we can talk about how to find solutions before government goes behind closed doors, throws something out the opposition opposes. The one point I might make, Leah, too, I think that's an interesting idea of there are ways we can modernize how we bring people into those discussions, whether it's changing consultations. Maybe you shouldn't have to put on a suit and sit in front of 8 MLAs in the old-fashioned way. Maybe there are ways we should be using social media. Maybe there are times you can have more roundtable formats with people. I think in the end, elected people still have to make decisions. I don't think there's I have no mandate to delegate the vote I was given to those who haven't gone through the same process David and I went through. Sure. The one other thing, though, is, sometimes we can go too far with this idea of fighting's unproductive. You know what? Some of the best moments in politics happen because somebody fought, and they fought on principle. When they fight over personal issues, that's fine, but I always hate it when we say, oh my gosh, if you look at some of the parliaments who dealt with very weighty issues, whether it was abolishing slavery in the U.S. or standing up to the Nazi threat in Great Britain.
Or bringing in Medicare in Canada.
Or bringing in, oh my goodness, that, and
Tommy Douglas did a little fighting.
He did a lot of fighting. We all think these things happen, equal opportunity or the charter, and everyone said, oh thank God. People fought. Right. And that's not bad.
Well, there's an infamous social credit member many years ago who said he wanted to keep politics out of the House of Commons. think what that means, but because I strongly agree with you. There are certain things on principle that are not only worth fighting about, they ought to be fought about if you're going to get social change. But I think the problem right now, as we've been touching on, is more the other way, that there's too much partisan bickering, and it isn't necessarily over matters of principle either. No. It's very often petty things that people in all parties do, and that's why I think the Westminster model that we've all been brought up in is too conflict-oriented, that we ought to be working at instruments once the elections are over. Elections are where those big battles should be fought, for sure, during an election campaign, and people decide. But then once we get into our legislatures or parliament, we should get a forum for, or work on methods of getting more consensus building decision making. I want to come back to one other thing, though, I did mention, and I think that's citizenship, that we ought to develop, and we've touched upon this, some provinces have set examples of a process of engaging the citizens where they have to be responsible. I want to come back to that. The citizens have to, too many of us, I can say that now because I'm not, although I remain committed to my own party philosophically, I'm not an active partisan these days. And there's too much of us as ordinary citizens, if I can put it that way, say, well, I would like this. I would like better schools, or I want improvements in health care. I want a community park built in my part of the city. But at the same time, we don't want to have our taxes raised. Right. And I think the people have to be confronted with that, are ordinary citizens. Yes. Politicians are reluctant to talk about tax increases now. Why? Because their citizens will howl every time a tax increase is mentioned. So I think a public engagement process on dealing with poverty or dealing with childcare or whatever is very good, and we should by the structure, encourage citizens to say, well, if I'm going to recommend this, I'm going to recommend, by the way, that we pay for it.
Right.
And, you know, they don't have to dot all the i's and cross all the t's of, you know, more taxes of this kind and less of that. But citizens ought to be encouraged to accept the notion that civilization costs money, public programs cost money, and if they're going to demand them, they should, in the same demand, that's my point, if they're going to propose something dealing with poverty, then they should simultaneously say, well, it's going to cost likely so much, and I as a taxpayer am prepared to pay my share for that.